What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. And yes, it's a solo dolo episode of the pod, but don't click off just yet because today it's a mailbag episode where I'm answering questions directly from our Subtext subscribers. Our Subtext subscribers get daily conversation and daily insight from me, Chris, and Jimmy directly to their phones. The first 14 days are free, worth $3.99 a month, and every week we have these episodes to answer their questions. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. The first question comes from Matt in Los Angeles, who asks, would you say this is the greatest lack of bench depth the Cavs have had in any LeBron James or Donovan Mitchell era? I can't imagine losing one starter to an injury. What's still possible, if anything? Well, Matt, I think this is an interesting conversation and an interesting point that you're making because of what the Cavaliers have lost this offseason and in recent years as well. Because there's been a lot of movement. And when you actually start listing the players who have left, it makes sense why it feels like Cleveland has lost so much depth. So here's a few. George Niang, Karis LeVert, Ty Jerome, Isaac Okoro, Tristan Thompson, Lonzo Ball, DeAndre Hunter, Keon Ellis, Dennis Schroeder, and of course, most recently, Max Strus. That's a pretty long list of players who, at different points, made an impact for this team. But I think there's an important distinction here. I don't necessarily think the Cavs have a bad roster. I think they've honed this roster with the playoffs in mind, to where at least among their top 7 to start the season and potentially their top 7 in the postseason, they're trying to make sure every player on the floor isn't somebody you can just target offensively or defensively and gets played off the floor. That's really what Cleveland has been trying to accomplish over the last few years. Now, I do agree with the larger point about the front court depth. That's where I think they've been depleted. You lose Dean Wade, you lose Larry Nance Jr., all in the same offseason, even though Larry was basically a non-factor for most of last season. And suddenly, you look at the roster and you've got Jarrett Allen, Evan Mobley, Thomas Bryant, and those are your true bigs. That's basically it. So now the Cavs are going to have to rely on the development of Peyton Watson at the power forward position, and they're going to need Naquan Tomlin to show that he can potentially give them something there too. And for both of those guys, it's not just about learning the position. It's about putting on enough strength to handle the defensive burden and the physical punishment of guarding players who are bigger or heavier than they are over the course of an entire season. And then eventually proving they can survive and do it again and again and again in the playoffs, because that's the part we don't know yet. I actually think the small forward position has more versatility than it did in the past, because now you got Jaylon Tyson and Peyton Watson, and those are two guys who can give you different things depending on the matchup. And honestly, I think there is a pretty deep list of backup guard options too. You got Craig Porter Jr., Tyrese Proctor, Malik Thomas, and they're all going to be competing for that opportunity to take the next step in their careers, which is becoming consistent rotation player rather than just getting spot minutes or not getting to play in the playoffs at all. And that's going to be one of the most interesting things to watch during the regular season and during training camp as well, because the Cavs are going to preach player development as they have in the past. They're going to give these young guys opportunities as they have in the past over an 82-game season. But at some point, those opportunities have to turn into legitimate rotation minutes and ultimately playoff opportunities. So yes, I understand why it feels like the Cavs have lost a ton of integral pieces, but I actually think they've refined their positional depth with the playoffs in mind. The question now is whether they have enough to withstand an injury. And that actually brings me to the next question, because one of the young players who could be really important to that depth is Jaylon Tyson. And you guys have heard me talk about Jaylon Tyson for a majority of this offseason. So the next question from our Subtext subscribers comes from Brian from San Diego, who comes in with some stats and information along with his question. He says, Jaylon Tyson made terrific strides last year during the regular season, shooting almost 45% from 3 on pretty good volume while averaging over 13 points and 5 rebounds a game. But then Jaylon Tyson's minutes went down significantly after James Harden was acquired, which seemed to impact his confidence at the most crucial time heading into the playoffs. What is your assessment of how Kenny Atkinson handled Jaylon Tyson late in the season and then in the playoffs? And do you foresee Jaylon Tyson performing better in the playoffs this season? Well, my goodness, that was a mouthful. I think this is a really good question, though, because it also gets into the decision Cleveland made this offseason to acquire Peyton Watson. But to answer your question, let's start with Kenny Atkinson. I think there are two sides to the evaluation of how Kenny handled Jaylon Tyson. And it really starts with what Kenny said after the James Harden acquisition, when he said Jaylon Tyson would still have to prove that he had earned or deserved playoff minutes. And I remember thinking about that because Jaylen had just gone through his 15-game stretch from January 10th through February 19th when he was playing some really good basketball. He had a couple of 20-point performances. He had scored 10 or more points in all of those games. He had the 39-point game against Philadelphia. His three-point shot was clicking. But what stood out to me wasn't necessarily the scoring itself, because we knew he had that in his bag from being at Cal. It was more about the chemistry in the two-man game that he was developing with Donovan Mitchell. There was a really good connection there in a short roll and half roll situation, and that was giving Cleveland something offensively that it hadn't had in previous years. He was spacing the floor, he was making decisions with the basketball, and even when Dean Wade wasn't on the floor, Jaylon Tyson was also taking on the responsibility of guarding the opposing team's best player. So when his opportunities started to dwindle, and some of the things Kenny was saying publicly started to sound a little cryptic, it gave me the impression that Kenny Atkinson was taking some of the little mistakes Jaylon Tyson was making and weighing those more heavily than the positives. Maybe it was losing an off-ball assignment. Maybe it was getting lost in transition. Maybe it was a poor read offensively. Maybe it was getting a little too dribble happy with the basketball on offense when you have two great creators in James Harden and Donovan Mitchell on that end of the floor as well. I can understand why a coach would be looking at those things, because Kenny Atkinson, as we know, throughout the entirety of the 82-game season, was thinking about the playoffs. He was thinking about the playoffs during training camp of last year. So he might be thinking, if Jaylon Tyson is making these mistakes in January, maybe it doesn't matter. But if he makes these kinds of mistakes in the playoffs, these could compound and cost them a possession, a run, maybe even a contest. And that's understandable to think about to an extent. Where I thought Kenny Atkinson was a little bit unfair to Jaylon Tyson was not necessarily giving him the opportunity to make those mistakes and learn from them, particularly in the postseason. Because Jaylon Tyson had done the work to get himself into that position. And I think some of the frustration was evident from Jaylon Tyson even toward the end of the regular season, when we talked to him in the locker room and when we talked to him when it comes to his interviews as well. Now, I will say that the decisions that Kenny Atkinson made were also understandable, because going up against a team like the Toronto Raptors and Jaylon Tyson being a bulkier, not necessarily running gun style of player, placing Jaylon Tyson on Brandon Ingram at the beginning of the Toronto Raptors series in the Eastern Conference first round didn't necessarily make sense. Brandon Ingram is long, he's wiry, he's really good at drawing fouls. That's a difficult matchup for a young wing as well. And then Jaylon Tyson got a little hot-headed against Detroit. He was letting out some of that frustration that we mentioned earlier. But honestly, I think the Cavs need that fire from him going forward, especially without Max Strus. I think they're going to need some of that edge from Jaylon Tyson this season, and that's where I keep coming back to the numbers. During the regular season, when Dean Wade was dealing with his injuries, Jaylon Tyson was primarily the defender on Cade Cunningham, and that happened quite a bit. Over 4 contests, Cade Cunningham shot just 27.8% from the field when Jaylon Tyson was his primary defender, and he scored just 17 points. Jaylen also had a similar effect on Jalen Brunson during the regular season, although that sample size was significantly smaller. And yet, there were multiple times during the Eastern Conference Finals when Jaylon Tyson was on the floor and somebody else was given the Jalen Brunson matchup. Didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and especially when we got to see how Jalen Brunson was just cooking the Cleveland Cavaliers defense, it made more sense to give an opportunity to Jaylon Tyson in that sense or in that setting, even though he may have lost some semblance of trust in the previous series. I think Kenny Atkinson needs to look at each series as its own entity rather than compounding what he saw in the mistakes that led up to the Eastern Conference Finals, because they could have used Jaylon Tyson in certain situations. At least I believe so. So I think that's something I'm going to be watching closely this season. And that gets us right back into the conversation with Peyton Watson, because if the Cavs organization believed wholeheartedly wholeheartedly that Jaylon Tyson could step into this starting small forward role. They also could have kept Max Strus and simply moved Max Strus to the bench. Instead, they decided to bet on another unproven wing in Peyton Watson while also getting rid of one of their more vocal leaders, their feisty guys, their grit players in Max Strus. I don't think that means the Cavs don't believe in Jaylon Tyson. I actually think the trade can help him because it gives him another year to develop without necessarily putting all of the pressure on him to immediately become the starting three and the small forward position. And now it adds into the competitive nature that we've seen from him in previous years, where he now gets to go up against someone who doesn't have the same rapport as Max Strus did over the last couple of years with Kenny Atkinson as well. And now you're kind of starting fresh. And Jaylon Tyson might have the upper hand when it comes to weighing in on the options. Although there's the obvious sentiment that Peyton Watson just got paid a good amount of money to come and be the starting small forward. So I think there would have to be a dramatic shift in the belief in Jaylon Tyson, but also what Peyton Watson does during the first couple games of this season that would prove that Jaylon Tyson would have to be moved into the starting small forward role. In short, I think Peyton Watson is your starting small forward to begin the season. Jaylon Tyson is going to be continuously fighting for this, but I also think Jaylon Tyson might work well in the second or third unit alongside Peyton Watson. If you have a certain lineup that entails Donovan Mitchell, Sam Merrill, Jaylon Tyson, Peyton Watson, and Jared Allen, I think that's stout. I think that gives Kenny Atkinson the spacing, the aggressiveness, the defensive fortitude that they need to not only guard on the perimeter, but also be able to protect the rim as well, as Peyton Watson and Jared Allen can play above the rim and do those kinds of things, while Jaylon Tyson and or Peyton Watson take on the more difficult assignments on the perimeter. And you still have Sam Merrill out there who's a good defender as well, plus the added shooting that Sam Merrill brings and Donovan Mitchell being Donovan Mitchell. But I also want to get back into the importance of what Jaylon Tyson is going to be getting when it comes to the reps, because I believe that they're going to be similar to what he got last year when Max Strus was sidelined for the first 67 games of the season. But I do think this is going to be a really important year for how Jaylon Tyson accepts his role and how strict Kenny Atkinson's leash is going to be as they get closer to the playoffs, because the first few months are going to be about development, right? They always are. But after the All-Star break and after the trade deadline, we're going to start seeing the true team form with this Cleveland Cavaliers roster. We're going to see who Kenny Atkinson trusts. We're going to see who he actually believes in that can survive in playoff basketball. And if Jaylon Tyson is mentally prepared, if he's matured, and if he continues to play the way he did during those stretches last season, I have a hard time seeing him outside of the top eight. And we know that the Cleveland Cavaliers have historically liked to shrink their rotation depth in the postseason to around 8 or 9 guys, obviously stretching it to 10 at the most, as we've seen in recent years. But for Jaylon Tyson, the talent is there, right? The question is more so about whether the trust is going to be there and how he can manifest that from the entirety of the season. Because ultimately, all of this depth discussion comes back to a bigger question about, is this roster good enough to actually win? And that gets into our next question from our subtext subscribers. The next one comes in from Daryl C. from Ventura, California, who asks, what do we still need as a team to compete for a championship, or do you feel that they have enough? And I think with the way that the offseason altered the Eastern Conference, and you guys have heard me say this ad an abundance this offseason already, there are a few things that the Cleveland Cavaliers need to happen to contend for a championship this season. But first and foremost, let's be clear, they have to be healthy for the entirety of the postseason run. That's number one. Beyond that, I think there are about 5 things that have to happen. And the first, obviously, is Evan Mobley taking that offensive lead. And I'm not just saying Evan Mobley suddenly needs to become a 30-point per game scorer, but he needs to be capable of being the number one option down the stretch when either James Harden or Donovan Mitchell is resting or they just don't have it on a certain night. He needs to have a go-to move. We've talked about this. I don't really care what it is. I could be looking at the baby hook. It could be a dream shake into a fadeaway. It could be a face-up dribble move where he gets by his defender. But he needs something that he can go to over and over and over again in a close game, something that's been converted to memory and instinct that he can rely on. And defensively, well, He needs to be able to wall up against players like Giannis, Joel Embiid, and to a lesser extent, Mitchell Robinson if they were to face off against the Miami Heat, the Philadelphia 76ers, or the Boston Celtics in a 7-game series. That's part of what I mean when I say Evan Mobley has to take another step, because there's still the question of whether or not he can be ready to play the full-time 5 position. And as we know, Jared Allen is still under contract, and Jared Allen is that initial deterrent. But how long is that going to be the case? And how long is the Cleveland Cavaliers going to be capable of relying on this too big lineup that hinders their spacing on the offensive end? And we've heard Jared Allen's name in trade conversations for years and years now. But whether that development actually takes form for Evan Mobley continues to show how indispensable Jared Allen is at this very moment. Because until Evan Mobley is strong enough or consistently ready enough to play that part in the defensive system rather than just being a help side defender, I think it's hard for the Cleveland Cavaliers to move on from Jared Allen because of the skill set that Evan Mobley has and has honed on the defensive end of the floor. The next thing about this that I think the Cleveland Cavaliers need to have for them to win a championship is Peyton Watson has to become the Cavaliers small forward that they've been hoping for and dreaming of, right? He doesn't need to become a star, okay? We don't need the same version that we saw for that month-long stretch when Nikola Jokic was out, right? He has to consistently be a spot-up shooter. He has to be a clear decision maker, which means not forcing anything, being able to be intentional with the basketball, knowing where the ball needs to go, knowing when he needs to get off the ball. And then also he has to be capable of running in transition and making life easier on the stars around him with his spacing and passing. Because we know James Harden loves to do his kick ahead passes, and I think Peyton Watson's ability to play above the rim is going to be beneficial in that, especially if they can continue the pace with James Harden on the floor, which we know and saw last season altered the entirety of how the Cavs offense worked in the half court. But if they were moving in transition, James Harden was likely the catalyst of that and getting the ball ahead and being able to move it so that the Cavs were getting ahead of the defense getting set and creating opportunities in that way. But for Peyton Watson, defensively, he has to be the guy who can take on the bigger matchups as well, especially if Jaylon Tyson's not going to be the starting small forward and Max Strus isn't here to take on those responsibilities, although he wasn't necessarily ready to do that himself. He was just the one tasked with doing that in the starting lineup. So those players like Jaylen Brown, Cade Cunningham, Jalen Brunson, and those bigger wings, those are going to be Peyton Watson's assignment. And we need to see him be able to take on those stout assignments against heftier guys down low as well, who like to put body to body in actions. And especially if he's playing the 4 next to Jared Allen and Evan Mobley, he has to be able to handle those bigger players there too. And I think that's the expectation because of the limited depth at the 4 position, which is their least deep position at the power forward, is that Peyton Watson is going to have to play those positions at some point. And that's a lot to put on a younger player still trying to figure out who he is in this league on a consistent night to night basis because he hasn't been a starter yet in this league. And now he's going to already get that responsibility. But that's also why Cleveland went out and got him, right? So the next portion of this is James Harden has to show up in the postseason. We have had this conversation for years across the NBA about how simple this is for James Harden. There can't be those stretches where he dribbles the clock away and the offense becomes stagnant and everybody else is just standing around waiting for him to make a decision because he eventually takes a questionable shot. And that's been some part of what James Harden's legacy has been in the postseason, right? He needs to be a knockdown 3-point shooter, especially off the catch and shoot, because we know that the Cleveland Cavaliers are getting him more spacing and the gravity that he has on the floor with him, whether that's Peyton Watson, Donovan Mitchell, Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, Sam Merrill, you have more spacing and he'll get cleaner looks. He'll have to knock those down as well. And obviously, he needs to be the floor general as the point guard of this team. But that also means limiting the turnovers compared to what we saw during the last postseason run, because that was simply unacceptable. Because the Cavs didn't bring James Harden back on a 3-year contract just to be a regular season piece. They need him to show up in the playoffs, right? And I think that coupled with what Donovan Mitchell has been capable of doing is going to help push them to where they want to be. But there's still a couple of other things, and I mentioned Donovan Mitchell here, right? We've seen Donovan Mitchell accept the superstar burden but he needs to play like a superstar and accept the responsibility on a nightly basis. Right. And to me, that means averaging somewhere in that 25 to 30 point range in the playoffs while still picking up smaller guards defensively. Right. You can't get lost off the ball. You can't get lost chasing around shooters because that's only going to take away some of the energy that you have to give on the offensive end as well. It means also because of the loss of Max Strus and because of the loss of some of these other glue type pieces, leading this team verbally, holding them accountable, and leading by example as he always has. But I feel like the vocal aspect of it is going to be important this season more than any because you do have other guys that will step up and talk, and Sam Merrill and Jaylon Tyson and James Harden and Thomas Bryant. But the voice of the franchise face just means more. It holds more weight. So leading by example is great, but you got to also use your voice in different scenarios when it calls for. And it also means sometimes you're just going to have to carry the team when it comes to leading by example, right? Because there's going to be nights, hopefully not, but there's going to be nights where James Harden doesn't show up, Evan Mobley doesn't have it, Jared Allen doesn't happen, or somebody's injured, right? So you're going to have to carry the team and find a way to win. And that's what the role of the superstar is. That's the role of one of the top 15 players in the league is. And this last portion, and I know I harp on him a lot, and I don't want to come off as being negative here, but the fifth piece of this puzzle is Kenny Atkinson. Kenny Atkinson just has to push the right buttons. And it sounds simple, but that means calling timeouts at the right time, trusting a young player or trusting the depth that he's spent the regular season developing, sitting a star if they're not meeting the standard that they've set for themselves, and also just drawing up plays and action that get the bigs involved more consistently than just, oh yeah, Jared Allen's a part of this team, and he reminds you that he exists and reminds you how important he is to this roster at this point. Because Kenny Atkinson can't play the game for these guys, but he has to put them in the best position to succeed. And if all five of those things fall into place, especially the part about them being healthy throughout a postseason run, I can see the Cavs not just getting through the Eastern Conference, but actually competing for a championship. And that's where I think the next question kind of gets interesting here. Because if you're going to say the Cavs have enough, you also have to ask whether they miss an opportunity to make this team significantly better this offseason, as if they could have made this situation easier on themselves by acquiring a different, more profound or more reliable or more proven player than someone like Peyton Watson. And that ultimately brings me back to Evan Mobley in the situation that unfolded this offseason because of what didn't happen. So the next question comes from Jonathan from North Olmsted, who says, the Cavs held on to Darius Garland until what I think was a low return on investment. Yes, there have been benefits to the trade, but I think we could have gotten more in earlier years. If Evan Mobley underperforms this year, was this summer the highest selling point for him, and are they now dealing with a deteriorating asset? I think this is where we get into why my offseason grade can't really be above a C plus or a B minus. And I mentioned this in a recent podcast with Chris, who gave them a B at this point in the offseason. Because there may never be another offseason like this one. You had three players of the caliber of Giannis Antetokounmpo, Jaylen Brown, and LeBron James become available. And the Cavs had a piece in Evan Mobley, who is arguably one of the most sought after young players in the NBA. And instead of using that opportunity to make another major swing, like they did by trading away Darius Garland, they decided to bet on Evan Mobley's upside. They're betting that he takes another leap, not just back to the All-Star or All-NBA caliber, but beyond that. Because we know Kenny Atkinson and Donovan Mitchell had him in MVP conversations over the next few years. Now, I want to be careful with the phrase depreciating asset because Evan Mobley is still just 25 years old. He hasn't reached his prime yet. And I think Evan Mobley is a great player, and I think he could end up being an all-time great, especially on the defensive end of the floor. But right now, the Cavs simply don't know what he's going to become, right? And that's the bet that they've made. They're betting on his future. They're betting on his timeline. And if he has the kind of season they believe he's capable of having, then I think this conversation looks very different. But if he underperforms again, then yeah, I think we're going to be having a look back at this summer a little bit differently. Because if Evan Mobley doesn't make an all-star team, doesn't make an all-defensive team, and doesn't make an all-NBA team for a second consecutive season, then this may have been his highest selling point, right? And that matters because I don't know when Cleveland is going to have another opportunity to put a player like Evan Mobley on the table in a trade for a superstar where they feel like they're going to be getting a return on their investment. Let's say Nikola Jokic becomes available at some point, or Luka Doncic becomes available. The likelihood that Cleveland is going to be able to simply poach one of those players, to me, is highly unlikely. So they have made a very clear decision. They're locking themselves in to the Evan Mobley timeline alongside Donovan Mitchell, as they both will be under contract until the 2029-2030 season. And now Evan Mobley has to show them that this was the right decision to make. That's why this season is so important for him. And that's why we talked about it for so long and so many different times this offseason. It's not just about whether Evan Mobley becomes a better player. It's about whether he becomes the kind of player that is confidently someone that you can build the rest of your championship roster around. And that's kind of the piece that we've been looking at, because everybody talks about Donovan Mitchell being the franchise face and Evan Mobley being a cornerstone, right? We have to be able to have the conversation about what is needed from Evan Mobley for this team to reach its championship ceiling. And then finally, we get to the question everybody is asking right now: what the heck is going on and going to happen with Cam Whitmore? So I want to end with this final question coming from Bob Thomas from Cleveland, Ohio, who asks, what is the status of Cam Whitmore? The Cavs have to do something in order to sign James Harden to the reported deal. And is there any idea who they may be looking at for the final roster spot? So the Cam Whitmore situation actually gives us a pretty good window or a good idea of what the Cavs have been trying to do financially here. Because when Cleveland acquired Cam Whitmore in that 5-team trade involving Peyton Watson, I think there was a pretty clear expectation that Cam Whitmore might not actually even make it to Cleveland, right? And the reason that this matters is that Peyton Watson came over in a sign and trade, right? So that means that automatically Cleveland became hard capped at the first apron. So they cannot even cross the $209 million threshold by even $1. And Cam Whitmore, well, he has a $5.4 million cap hit for next season. And the Cavs are very close to the first apron hard cap that they have. And also, you look at the James Harden numbers, who's coming back on a 3-year, $97 million deal. So Cleveland has a few different paths that they can take when it comes to the Cam Whitmore situation. They can waive and stretch him, as they did with Ricky Rubio, and take on that number, and we'll get into that specifics in a second here. They could also try to trade him for a player with a smaller veteran minimum contract or a non-guaranteed deal, which they could get off of at some point during the season. Or they could trade him for another player and ultimately waive and stretch that player, right? So there's a lot of different juggling and different high stepping that this Cleveland Cavaliers organization is trying to work on to understand what is going to happen. And I think the biggest portion of this decision-making process for the Cleveland Cavaliers that is notable as of right now is that the Cavs have to make a decision by Saturday, August 29th, because of the situation that they're in. But I did mention that I was going to give you guys the numbers when it comes to the waive and stretch scenario for Cam Whitmore. So if the Cavs were going to waive and stretch him, instead of having the $5.46 million hit their books this season, they could stretch that contract to roughly $1.82 million per year over the next 3 seasons. And look, Cam Whitmore is 22 years old. Some of the fan base even thought that he could help the Cavs because he's 6'6" and can guard on the wing and all these different things. But Cleveland is trying to win right now. That's why they traded Max Strus. That's why they brought in Peyton Watson. That's why they re-signed Donovan Mitchell. That's why they're bringing in James Harden. And Cam Whitmore simply doesn't have the experience to be an immediate impact and even to compete with guys who the Cavs organization already has trust with at the wing position, or at the guard position as well. They're trying to put together a team that can legitimately compete in the East again, right? Because they just came off an Eastern Conference Finals appearance. They have an understanding of what it takes to get there, although they did get demolished in that Eastern Conference Finals series against the New York Knicks in 4 games. So when I look at the final roster spot, the question isn't really who has the most upside. It's who can actually help this team win games this season and also win games in the postseason. And I think the Cavs need to take the veteran minimum route because if you're looking at the roster numerically, I think the front court is where they have the biggest need, particularly at the four, the power forward position, as I mentioned earlier. They added Peyton Watson. You got Evan Mobley. You got Jared Allen. Mario Hazonia is now here. Don't know how long he's going to be here either. And Thomas Bryant gives you another big body, although he can stretch the floor. So he could be considered a power forward, but I don't think we're even going to get there. But when I look at that roster and ask, where could Cleveland need another experienced NBA player? I'd rather see them use that last spot on somebody who can give them functional minutes at the power forward position than just add another guard to this lengthy list that they already have. And that's why I'm starting to look at the remaining free agents around the margins around the league. And Nicholas Batum is a name that jumps out to me, right? Obviously, I'm not saying Nicholas Batum is signing right now. I'm not saying this is sourced. I'm not saying this is information I'm having. I'm saying this is a fit that I could see because he's a veteran, he's a leader, he's big enough to play the four, he can space the floor, he understands how to play without dominating the basketball. And there's the Kenny Atkinson connection through the French national team, which I think is at least worth mentioning. Another name that comes to mind, he's a little bit bigger, is Nick Richards. Because if you're worried about the physicality, the grit, the depth of your front court, I think Nick Richards gives you another legitimate big. And he can rebound, he can protect the rim, as we know the Cavs like to do, and he gives you a different look behind Evan Mobley, Jared Allen, and maybe even Thomas Bryant, depending on the situation. But yes, I do have to give you another potential option that the Cavs could go with, and that's a different direction looking back at the backcourt situation as well with Bruce Brown Jr., who we've talked about in passing on the podcast this offseason. If Cleveland went that route, I think it would tell you something very specific about how the Cavs view their backcourt depth and what their belief level is for what they're building. Because you can look at this roster and you say, why do you need another guard? You've obviously got Donovan Mitchell and James Harden. You've got Craig Porter Jr., Tyrese Proctor, and Malik Thomas, who the Cavs have invested in, who they believe in, and who we've heard that they're kind of high on at this part of the offseason. But if the Cavs don't want to put too much responsibility on one of those young players down the line, Bruce Brown Jr. makes sense as a veteran insurance policy and a connection to the coaching staff. He's been part of a championship team. He can defend, he can handle the basketball, he can play on or off the basketball, and he doesn't necessarily need to be your primary creator to have an impact. So I think there are really two different philosophies for that final roster. You could use it to address the front court depth, which I think is probably the more obvious roster need right now, or you could use it to address veteran guard depth and say, we don't necessarily need another big because we're going to lean heavily on Evan Mobley, Jared Allen, Thomas Bryant, and Peyton Watson. But we don't want to be in a situation where Donovan Mitchell and James Harden gets hurt and suddenly you're looking around and you're like, Craig Porter Jr., Tyrese Proctor, rookie Malik Thomas, and you're asking them to take on more than they can chew or more than they are going to be able to sustain. And then also having Donovan Mitchell and or James Harden come back from injury in this hypothetical scenario. And then Kenny Atkinson doesn't use them, although they have been developing in the regular season. Right. So personally, I'd lean toward the front court because I still believe that this team needs an enforcer. I mentioned that when we were talking about the draft earlier into the offseason. I mentioned that last year as well because an enforcer allows you to kind of have more stout personality when you're going up against some of these rough and tumble teams. They're not going to take any nonsense. And it means a little bit more to take a shove from a 6'10, 6'11 guy with a little bit of muscle on him than if James Harden is getting into a spat with another guard on an opposing team. Right. To bring this full circle, I do think the important thing here is that Cam Whitmore is no longer really going to be in the question. Maybe he was never part of the equation at all. because the question now is what the Cavs believe is going to be the final piece that makes this roster work, because they made most of their major decisions, right? Committing to Donovan Mitchell, bringing James Harden back, Evan Mobley's continued development, betting on Peyton Watson, Jaylon Tyson getting another opportunity. Now they have basically one, maybe two final roster spots to fill. And whoever they put there is going to tell us quite a bit about what Cleveland believes this team still needs to actually compete when the games start and when the games get tough in the postseason. So I do believe that the Cleveland Cavaliers are going to show us what they believe about this roster in the coming days, not even coming weeks. And then we're going to start seeing more of the mini camps. We're going to go see the potential of the training camp and the readiness of this unit and what kind of identity this team is going to have. There's going to be a lot of things to come out of the woodwork because of the decisions that happened in this offseason. But again, as I've said recently on different podcasts, I do think that on paper, this is a decent team. This is a team that has been refined, and now we have to see what happens when they throw the basketball up and go hoop, because that's what it ultimately comes down to. Are you going to be healthy? Are you going to mesh? Is there going to be chemistry? Is there going to be leadership in the locker room? All these different things have to come to fruition for this Cleveland Cavaliers team to hit its peak, to hit its ceiling, which is winning a championship. And as we've talked about on this podcast, the Cleveland Cavaliers organization have set the bar for themselves based on the conversations that they've had with us. They believe in a championship window, that it's still open, that they can compete with Philadelphia, New York, and the other upper echelons of the Eastern Conference. And then also turning over to the Western Conference and looking at Oklahoma City, San Antonio, Denver still in this mix, Los Angeles, whoever you want to call it, Minnesota. The Western Conference is also going to be a different beast that the Cleveland Cavaliers would have to overcome. So that's why the start of this season is going to be important, because they're chasing wins. They're going to be chasing an expectation. They're going to be trying to set themselves up to be in the best position when the playoffs come around when it comes to seeding. But it all begins with the decisions that they've made this offseason and the belief that they're curating in what is going to take place at the beginning of training camp and what is going to happen throughout the 82-game grind. So I appreciate you guys sticking with me for another mailbag episode where we got to answer subtext questions. 2026-2027 season is soon and fastly approaching, and I'm very excited for all of it. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. Want to have your questions answered on the next week's episode of Hey Chris, or a mailbag episode with just me? This is the only way to send in your questions. So sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word stop. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.